Play. Alright everyone, welcome back to the second video in my Styx painting video. This is Big Deno. So this second video in the series focuses on OSL, object source lighting, or directional lighting, or whatever you want to call it. And you can see that I've started with a white, and I'm very carefully spraying it in the direction. This is great camera work. I've started this video well. I think we all want to see a bit of black cardboard with some very roughly painted lines for our painting videos. So well done me. Anyway, I'm starting with some white, and I'm aiming that from the direction that the light is coming from. There's a specific reason that I've started with white, and that is because when you use a color like this red, which is a very vibrant saturated color, if you were to paint that straight over a dark color, particularly through an airbrush, you tend to get a duller version of the color. So by doing the white spray first, it just gives the red a little bit more vibrancy. So one of the advantages of using the airbrush to put in preliminary colors, and it's important that I note that this is preliminary work, not the final light work. It makes that whole process easier, quicker, and it puts it in approximately the right spot. However, it doesn't always go exactly where it should, and so that's why the brush work, the second part of the process, is the next and more important bit. So you can see from this shot the red's been positioned roughly from below. We're getting a good sense of where the directional light is coming from, and so what I'm going to do now is, probably in a very haphazard way, move back and forth between the shadows and the lights. And what I'm doing in this particular stage here is I'm actually putting in shadows on the fabric. So if you've got two light sources, which we do, we've got the light coming from above and the light coming from below, there's a part where the two meet, which tends to be a little bit darker, and that's more evident on things like these folds as opposed to like a skin tone, which is more of a singular volume. So I'm using a darker red here. I'm actually using a mixture of Tindalos red from scale 75, Fantasy range, and Antares red, which is from scale 75, normal range. And I am placing that in the lower areas of the volumes to try and create that red underglow light. So what you're seeing here is that I actually, as per usual, didn't get the mixture right on my airbrush layer of the red. I went a little bit too heavy, so it wasn't dilute enough, and so the airbrush, it's more evident when you use a color like the scale 75, which is quite a thick color, and you don't get the dilution right. It can come out just a tiny bit grainy, or get sort of very obvious pixelation spattering. It's pretty hard to see on this video. If you were to zoom in and have a closer look, you'd be able to see it. So I'm just doing some thin glazes over the top of those areas where that red spatter is just a little bit noticeable, to try and improve and smooth those areas out. So this would not normally be something I would do during this process, but just to try and clean up those extra red spots that I don't want. So, directional lighting, OSL, object source lighting, whatever you want to call it, is really, really interesting to challenge yourself with. I like doing it because as I've gotten quicker and more experienced at painting, I found there's two things. You relax and enjoy the painting, and you almost switch off your brain a little bit, and you don't have to think as much. But sometimes you want to have some challenges and be forcing yourself into really understanding how the surfaces and the lights interact together. And so, an OSL or a non-metallic metal, as an example, is a subject that forces you to really think about how the light will interact with these surfaces, and in different ways than you might normally. So it's sort of a good learning exercise, a good experience piece to try and get you thinking about light, which, as I've said on many of my videos, is always the first thing you should think about and what you should always come back to. So the airbrush does cover probably more than it should with this lighting from below. So what I'm doing here is I'm going back in and cleaning that up so there's a much sharper delineation from the light from above and the light from below. And that, again, the airbrush creates a good surface to start with, but it's not going to give you a convincing end result for the way that light would interact. It also has a different finish to the rest of the model, which has brush strokes and texture, to have this very, very smooth area that is ignoring how different surfaces would react. It doesn't look right, and that's probably an area that I've got left to learn and improve with every bit of painting I do, I guess, but more related to OSL or non-metallic metals, is that different surfaces reflect light differently, and a lot of my work tends to have a similar level of reflectiveness. So if you look at the fabric versus the wings, it's got a similar level of saturation and value, whereas it probably should be slightly different. So the thing I finished talking about in the last video, when I was rudely interrupted before it finished, was actually about the wings. It's a refreshing beverage, as I hadn't really come up with a plan for the wings at this stage. In my head, I considered doing. I've been watching the Lord of the Rings making of videos recently, and in there's a segment where one of the makeup artists does some really cool stuff with an airbrush and makes someone look older and ages someone up. And so I sort of, in my head, thought maybe that would be interesting to do, try and do thin lines like veins going through the surface of the wings, and then using lots of transparent airbrush layers over the top to try and homogenize it. So that was sort of where I was initially thinking, but as it progressed, I moved away from that. So you can see I've just did a quick airbrush layer there, and that was of some contrast color to, again, smooth and homogenize all of the surfaces together. And I've started to block in some color on the wings, and I think by this stage of the paint job, the wings I felt like were not detracting from the model, but just taking away focus from the big tubby lubs rhino melon head. So I didn't want to make the wings too much of a focal point. So I started adding some red, crimson, something red contrast, what's the name of it? It's right. Flesh Tearers Red. I think that's it. Contrast paint, and I also use that on the other red areas to darken up the color a little bit. And then I start doing successive layers of washes and paints over the wings, using my hairdryer to dry them very quickly, and end up just adding lots of different colors and shades into the skin. Well, I think here I'm actually using Volupus Pink again, and I actually just do the wings predominantly with the airbrush. And so this is sort of, I guess, what I was planning on trying to do, but I did want to do veins and skin spots underneath this airbrush layer. So that's something I'm going to come back to with another project, I think. There's the hairdryer, probably the greatest tool in the arsenal in terms of creating speed. So I am just bringing back some of those lights. More importantly, smoothing out some of the roughness and also helping clean up those red dots I was talking about earlier. They're still there, they're still present, but it's much less evident underneath this. I think if you want to see a little bit more about how I use the airbrush for this technique, the Conan video I did uses this sort of smoothing process several times, so you can get to see that in depth. So I won't talk too much about it here, but I think you can see it's really helped homogenize and smooth a lot of the roughness of the way that I approach painting. It does have the downside of removing contrast, so you have a tighter value change, so it doesn't go from as larger contrasts, but that's something that I can continue to refine with a brush. It is just a very quick process though, which is why I do it, and it's also super duper fun. So there's a few other elements on this model that need to be painted as well, which is these horn bits and the scythe itself. And I really can't remember the order that I do them in, because my painting process is just freeform. I paint what I feel like painting at any given time. I think about the whole piece and how it appears as a whole piece, and sometimes I feel like I need to do certain areas to get a better understanding of how the model's going to look. And in this instance, the red was obviously going to be a pretty crucial and integral part of the model, but I didn't have a clear concept of how it would interact with the other colors, so I felt like I needed to do the red before I started tweaking other elements. So I've used a little bit of green in this mixture to highlight the black. It's a very pale green, super subtle. If you look at it fairly closely, you can see the greenish-ness, but it does still look mostly black. The green was a specific choice to just have that slight contrast with the red. Everyone knows complementary colours. Everyone gets taught those in school. One of the most interesting revelations I took away from a class with Meg Maples that I did was, as she said, red and green doesn't necessarily have to be that normal green, forest green and bright vibrant red, which is very reminiscent of Christmas colours. You can have lime green, you can have ultra dark green, you can have warm yellow green, you can have magenta, you can have deep dark red, you can have cold red, you can have warm red. So all of these different things still work with that complementary color contrast, but without necessarily immediately jumping out at you as, Christmas colors or specific colors. So here, by using a very, very, very pale green, just makes the horn stand out a little bit more, contrast a little bit more with the red from below. But I didn't want them to be bright, vibrant green or too green, as my previous piece that I did, the Angel and Demon, did use a lot of vibrant greens and vibrant reds, and it was pretty full on, pretty eye-watering, a punch in the eyes. Yeah, this is just horns. This isn't very interesting. I'm just highlighting the horns with normal painting methods that everyone can do. Most people can do, I guess. Sure, there are some people who do not possess the physical dexterity due to a variety of reasons. I very much doubt if those people are watching a video on how to paint things, though. So let's assume, for the sake of this video, that you do possess the ability to do this. Congratulations. I'm just going to take another drink while I'm painting this fabric cloth thing. So one of the things I tend to default to is textured fabrics, or textured cloth, or textured leather. I think when you take a skin tone which tends to be quite smooth and you put it next to a textured piece of fabric or textured object, you have another layer of contrast, the contrast between smooth and textured, that helps draw your focus where it needs to go. But I do think I sometimes overuse that and fall into textured habits just because it's also easier and quicker. So we're getting into something now which is one of the important parts of the airbrush smoothing technique, and that is re-adding contrast and re-adding the shadows into your volumes. When you use the airbrush, as I said earlier, to smooth out, it does homogenize the surfaces and smooth transitions, which is great, but it also takes away some of the contrast you've put in. So it's important to go back in and add that contrast using the darker colors. So here it's with Arbuckle's Brown, and you can see that I'm putting it back in the important areas of the volumes, bringing the really deep shadows back in and helping to separate those volumes. And there's a pretty big visual change when you do this. It really does help the surfaces look like distinct objects while still having some of that unified look as well. I like Arbuckle's Brown on this skin tone for that particular color because it's a slightly purple color, slightly purple brown, and it helps fit in with that initial purple weirdness that I had going on. So I do dilute this paint with a little bit of Joe Sonia Magic Mix, and because this is a scale fantasy color, it is very slightly translucent, so it does tend to work really well for putting in shadows and creating a smooth transition as well. I don't actually have any idea what this is. I think it's red. I think it's dark red. Yep, no clue. Might be. Yeah, that's Arbuckle's brown. There you go. I'm using Arbuckle's brown and the shadows of the red as well. We're all learning together. So as per previous videos, this video is running at x2 speed times 2. And my previous video went for about 40 minutes of running time, which means it was about an hour and a half of painting. And this one is about 50 minutes, which is about an hour and 40 minutes of painting. So all up on this model, I've spent about 3 hours. And I think with the base included, I did a total of about 4 hours work on this model from start to finish. So many at times I've watched these videos and I've gone, oh, why did I do that the way that I did it? Surely I could have been quicker. I did the airbrush, and then I just went over an area that I'd painted, and then I had to go back and repaint it, and then I re-airbrushed it again. Like, surely I could have done a better job with that. And the answer is yes, I probably could have done a better job in how I airbrushed or how I approached the specific colors and done slightly better transitions with my brush, and that may have sped up the process. But by the same token, I've still spent a total of 4 hours on this model, which is significantly quicker than I think a lot of other people would spend on getting this result. Which brings me back to the point I made in the very first video of this series, which is I'm not the best painter in the world at all, but I am definitely one of the quickest. So this technique, the way that I paint, is more focused on achieving a high quality result quickly than it is on achieving a competition winning result in whatever time it takes to achieve that result. If that makes sense. And these techniques can be extrapolated onto other figures and other scales. I've done a number of gaming figures. I say a number, I mean a metric shit ton. It's obviously where most of us started. But recently I used these techniques to paint an AOS army, a Nurgle army. It was somewhere in the vicinity of 150 models, and I did that in 6 weeks. And they were all pretty awesome. I've also done some board game figures, Rising Sun, on this channel, which you can check out. Spent about 2 hours, 3 hours on a Rising Sun model. And I do have some plans to show some more of my techniques on gaming figures coming up in the future. Okay, apparently we're going to do some non-metallic metal on this super cool scythe. And yes, I have to say that I didn't notice that there was a naked chick that actually made up this scythe until I literally put the model together. I had never noticed the fact that it's a super cool naked chick with wings that is actually making up this scythe. So that is a very, very cool addition to this model. This is, of my finished results, this is one of the aspects of this model that I'm least happy with. The there's a few parts of it where I really liked how it looked, and then I just decided to do one or two things more, and then it basically put me back at square one where I didn't like it. So the colours I've used here are Nocturna, Chalice Red, and this is Orchid Light. Again, just coming all the way back to the start, in the very first video I talked about the purple colours, and so I wanted to have a lot of purple light feeling around this piece, which would then tie in with the red light from below, so it would all have similar atmospheric colours. So I started with purple for the metal. And when I'm doing this sort of style of non-metallic metal, which is a style I certainly have, copy's not the right word, that I've evolved after seeing other people's approach to non-metallic metal. The sketchy nature of this first part is often just about establishing where you want the light to go before you then go in and further refine. So this stage is just super rough, getting a feeling for where the light should reflect off the surface and how they should bounce off each other, which is super fun. And then also how the light will interact with the red light coming from below. So I'll try and explain the thought processes, I guess, as we go. I've used Orchid Light. I've mixed in ivory into the Orchid Light, which has got this color here. The placement of these lights is based on, obviously, the light coming from above, from the top left, and then you get a few little lights bouncing around, bounce lights, I guess, and then the light from below where you get the red. So that's all sketched and a pretty basic idea of what it will look like. So I then start to add in some different colors. This is a green. I've already discussed green on this previously. It's actually emerald, this color, VGC emerald. The reason I used the green, not just to tie in the contrast, but also because I felt like this didn't look like a metal. It didn't look metal enough. Metal! No, it didn't look that it like was a metallic surface, and so I think a lot of metallic surfaces have a bluish greenish sort of color, which is usually environmentally related. So even though there's no green in this environment as such, I felt like it might help it read better to the viewer as metal. So touch of green. Switch to a smaller brush here so I could be a little bit more precise. The first sketches were done with a size 2, might have even been a size 3. And this is the Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 1 magnificent brush. Probably do 50 to 60% of my painting with this brush, this size brush, maybe less. I do a surprising amount with the larger ones, the size 1 and 2, the size 2, and I do fairly little with the size 0. I don't usually go smaller than a size 0 ever. So yeah, that green tint helped it feel a little bit more like metal to me, and so I think it achieved what I wanted it to achieve, which is great. And I was actually really quite happy with how this part was looking here. It was looking like it was reading as metal. It wasn't quite refined enough yet, but it felt like I had the placements of lights and everything right. And I was just tweaking, which is fun part. So that's good at this stage. And then I balls it up. Let's go. Let's balls it up. Yeah, so I do balls it up. I can't remember exactly how, but I know that I spent about 3 cracks trying to get this right, I think. About 3 times. I don't know if I've done a video really fully on my approach to non-metallic metal, so that might be a topic for another video, but I think the most important thing is you have to have a clear understanding of the light source and how that light should read off those surfaces, and it's usually the opposite of how it would read off a not metallic surface. You need to have a higher level of contrast from light to dark, so it needs to go from much darker up to much lighter generally, and there's a lot more to it, so I might do that in a video, I think, at another time. Anyway, so what I'm trying to do here now is add in the other colors, add in the deeper shadows, continue to refine this result so that it looks like metal. And I decided to put a contrast color on this, which is Griff Charger Grey, just harkening back to that point I made about the green, just to help reinforce that it's a metal. It tends to read more like metal with a bit of blue and or green in it. So then hair dryer, drying it off, great stuff. At this point I actually quite liked that look, thought it looked pretty cool. Just needed to add some really sharp pop lights and also bring a little bit more of the red back. So that's what this is here. I'm taking the Vallejo Ivory and preparing for some red to be sprayed from below. I don't think I sprayed actually, I think I just do it with a brush. Yep, there you go. Bang, get a bit of red up here. And the metal is very reflective. So it should be almost some of the brightest light, because it will be reading as almost the same level of intensity as the source light. Yes, that looks super cool. I'm very, very happy with this at this point. Time to balls it up. So I have a rule that I prescribe to, which I think is probably the most important rule of painting that exists, and it's called the rule of cool. So sometimes you do things that maybe break rules of traditional light or traditional art, philosophy, or colors, or whatever it may be. But as long as it looks cool, I think you get away with it. And it's a good rule because it's so subjective. Like what I think is cool, other people might not think is cool. So that's why it's a great rule, because you can just do whatever you want. And that's why I like it. So sometimes with this sort of non-metallic metal, I do things that probably aren't 100% correct in terms of light and the way it should interact, but it helps make the object look cool, so I do it anyway. So again, this stage I'm doing right here with the very bright lights, this is when all the work you've done prior to this actually starts to read as metal. It's at this point that it looks like metal. All of the other stuff will help shape the piece and give you all of those nice subtle nuances, but it doesn't ever look like metal until you do your last bright lights, and that's when the surface reads as metal. So it's an important thing to keep in mind that you can spend all this time and effort and energy doing an awesome non-metallic metal object, but it won't actually look like metal until the very last highlight. And here is where I mess it all up. Go the airbrush, go Deno, you idiot, you pillock. So I used some Flesh Tearers red, I think, and tried to make the object look more like metal, reflecting red light. What a pillock, what an idiot. Just all that great work gone in a blink of an eye. It is an angle that I do not look at much on this model, and I get to observe it from commentating these videos, so quite fascinating. Alright, so this next probably 5 minutes of the video is all airbrushing, and it's me firstly trying to recover that metal weapon, but also using lots of translucent layers on the wings, as I discussed a little bit earlier in the video. So I've actually mixed mostly like contrast colors or the scale fantasy colors, which are translucent, and a little bit of the Joe Sonia medium, so that when they come out of the airbrush, the pigment will separate evenly, and you can see that it's collecting a little bit more in the recesses, which is, you know, traditional wash, how a wash would work, but I'm doing it with an airbrush, so I'm doing it in half the time and having very few tide marks as a result. So another little trick, another little airbrush trick for you there. What a great way to learn about using an airbrush. The best way is always to do it yourself, though, and experiment. Knock the guy over, good work. So I decided to bring some highlighting back in. These wings are a great a great surface to do this with because of the very obvious and interesting texturing. So if you use the angle of the airbrush to your advantage here, it will create that level of highlighting for you, which is super fun. And you can see the angle of the brush and how that's bringing the highlights in, and I'll then continue to do some more washes and shading with the airbrush. I probably should edit this out in future. A lot of effort though to edit that out. A lot of effort. I think I'm just going to continue leaving it in there and criticizing myself for doing so. As the paint job continues to progress, you can see the back side of the model is significantly darker and has much less attention focused on it. Two reasons for that. One, I try to have a very fixed viewing angle, or at least a few viewing angles that generally are from the front, as most of my works are designed to be put in a cabinet or looked at. You don't often get a lot of people picking them up and spinning them all the way around. But the way that the light source is painted on, most of that area would be in shadow or darker anyway. So just a really good excuse for me to not have to paint boring stuff. But I do actually put a fair bit of effort into the rear of this guy based on the fact that the plinth is a circular one, so he will be spun around a lot. So I'm using the airbrush here with a lot of contrast paints and a lot of the translucent colors, just adding some nuances into the wings, but I also add a little bit of colour into the skin as well. I think I actually pull out a teal colour and do some teal in the skin maybe later. Alright, so here I try to recover the airbrush work or the really bad red airbrush work that I did here. So I start using white and try to recover it. And then because I have my paint too dilute, I mess it up again on this bit of metal, and you get to see some awesome spider lines, which is super cool. Love videoing myself doing things fucking terribly. Go me. I guess the takeaway from this for me, and I don't really get upset about making mistakes like this because it's easy to fix. It doesn't take long to fix. The only time I get, I guess, frustrated is if I've done something that I really like and then I try to push it further and don't quite get it the way I want. But even then, it's a momentary frustration, and then I just start thinking about how to fix it and learning how to fix it. So this metal side didn't end up quite cool, but I think I liked it more before I added the red and the poor white tide marks. Look at that. That's like a half moon there. Awful stuff. But fixable. That you can see right there was a bit of the old AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, which is an important part of my process. I use the Ultra Matte Varnish to homogenize all the surfaces and take away some of the reflective properties of both the contrast paints that I've talked about in this video, as well as different paint manufacturers have different levels of reflective surfaces. So using the AK Interactive Matte Varnish helps bring everything together and homogenize the surface and lets your eye read the surface a little bit better. So I think I definitely glued that spear haft on, and I did that so that I could paint the whole model with the light source from below that was relevant, and you'll see as we begin that very soon. I use Hull Red, Layer Model Color Hull Red, for the base of the wood to tie it in with those colors, same as before. I think I have actually done a little bit of work on the metal to recover it, so if we see that looking significantly better, that's why. It wasn't anything different to the processes I already showed, just repetition of those processes, but probably slightly better airbrush use. If we show it. Oh, yep, I did. All right, so there's about 10 minutes of painting left on this video. It seems like not a lot of time. It's 5 minutes worth of footage. It seems like not a lot of time to make the OSL look convincing, but guess what? It is, because it is a very, very simple process, and you're about to see it. One of the greatest tricks in my arsenal. So I'll explain the concept behind the technique first, and then you'll be able to see it. So when you have a very bright light, you have stronger and more powerful colors coming from that area. So the best way to see this in action on a model is to take a white undercoat and a black undercoat and paint the same color over both of them. Even if you use exactly the same color, exactly the same consistency, the white will provide a more vibrant and saturated color than the black undercoat. I think most people would sort of intuitively understand that. So to get a convincing source lighting effect or a convincing effect of light, you need to have a bright undercoat for that area to go under, to go underneath. And so the way that I do a convincing light effect is exactly what you're seeing on screen now. I'm painting white, or in this case ivory, in the areas where I want the light source to be strongest. So all of that pre-work that we did with the airbrush is important for understanding the light and creating a transition between the existing model area and where the light will be strongest. But this is all done with brushwork. This is all positioning the light in a very considered way, using the brush to position it. Once again, there isn't a lot of precision with these brush strokes because the next stage will correct a multitude of sins and help sell the illusion. It's very, very simple. I'm using Vallejo Model Air Fluorescent Red, Scale 75, Antares Red mixed together to create a super intense saturated red. And I'm mixing in with Joe Sonia Magic Mix, and I am just going to slap it on. You can see the first layer is that you can get a sense of how dilute it is. This is a glaze, but it is quite a powerful glaze. It's quite strong. The magic mix helps it not collect too much or collect in ways I don't want it. So it's just going on there very roughly, super quickly, covering over those white lines that I made. And then I'm going to grab the hairdryer and dry that out very, very quickly. And then I'm going to do it again with the exact same mix, which is the Scale 75, Antares Red, and Vallejo Fluorescent Red. And each successive layer that I do, and I think I probably do about 3 or 4 or maybe 5 layers, the white from underneath is still coming through and making these colors look more vibrant. And where there is no white and I'm still painting over the top of, as you can see, the magic mix and the other colors is helping to create a transition there by the way that the paint is gathering in that area. So this is the extent of the trick. I use this in a lot of the painting that I do in many ways. Like this is actually brush version of the airbrush technique, but because it's with a brush, it's a little bit more controlled and you're getting a little bit more of a precise result that isn't necessarily removing the deep dark contrast in the same way that the airbrush does, but you're not getting that same ultra smoothing effect unless you do lots and lots of brush layers, which is what you're doing with the airbrush when you do this, but you're obviously able to do it much quicker. And that's it. We're effectively finished. Thank you. I'll see you in the next video.